The agenda for today is all about Optimism, one of the fastest growing layer twos within Ethereum. We're going to explain, from the basics, what it is, how it's set up, what makes it different, the current state, diving not just into the network itself, but the ecosystem and the protocols building on top of Optimism, and finally the path ahead. Optimism does have several upgrades in the near future that have large implications and potential opportunities coming out of it. So before that, let's just give a quick messages about Into the Block. We released our Risk Radar product. It's still in the alpha version. We expanded to a new protocol in Polkadot called Moonwell. It's a lending protocol. It's free to access. So like with our previous Risk Radar product, we're setting this free for any user to access. We go very deep into economic risk for lending protocols, and we're expanding it beyond lending protocols soon. The idea here is to create a source of knowledge where you can access near real-time economic risk data and create confidence for DeFi to expand to a broader user base and attract more institutions over time. And finally, we just recently released Optimism metrics. So we added the Optimism network, tokens within the network, as well as an array of new assets listed within Optimism and the multi-chain functionality, so that you can change between like USDC on Ethereum versus USDC on Optimism. We also supported it for Avalanche and soon for Polygon as well. So I won't share too much just now, because that'll be the main subject for the presentation. So what are layer twos? These terms get thrown around a lot, and so for everyone to be up at the same level, just wanted to clarify how the core infrastructure works. So layer ones are the base layer. There's the so-called parent chain, and they're the source for the final settlement where transactions are settled, and the data availability layer, the data storage, happens. Layer twos are a child network on top of these blockchains. They are off-chain. They have their own ways to manage transactions. The way typically they work with layer twos is that they batch multiple transactions into a block producer, which is called as the sequencer. They provide a soft guarantee that the transaction is final. They batch and compress the data and then finally send it to the L1 chain, which validates the transactions and carries on with activity. And there, I guess the core concept behind L2s is to scale networks. So they started initially from a research perspective with like Lightning and Bitcoin, but they've expanded quite vastly within Ethereum, Optimism being one of the first in doing so. So Optimism was first introduced from a research perspective back in June 2019, and they've since accomplished quite a few milestones. So the core concept is that they have the optimistic virtual machine, which is their own engine to process transactions and batch them. It is differentiated by being EVM equivalent, so not just EVM compatible, but in theory the same exact code for a dApp for a protocol in layer one is equivalent in layer two, and that makes it a lot simpler and faster to deploy for developers. The reason why they're called optimistic rollups is because they essentially assume you're innocent until being proven guilty. So what I mean by that is that they have these mechanisms known as fault proofs that batch transactions, right, as I mentioned, and they send those to layer one, and they have a challenge period where these transactions are like verified to make sure that they're correct. But in principle, from the get-go, they're assumed to be correct. There is a potential like for finality not being reached if within the challenge period everything is found as faulty. But in general, this makes it a lot more efficient and faster, and it's very different from the way like CK rollups work, where they do have more formal functions. Hence why those are like the two main type of layer 2s, and they have their different proving mechanisms. As I mentioned, you have the sequencer being the core part of layer 2s, like Optimism. They batch block production of multiple transactions and send them to layer 1. At this time, there's only one single sequencer operated by multi-sig of anonymous users. And this creates, a certain potential central point of failure, and hence some of the arguments of against layer 2s at the moment. But as I'll mention later in the presentation, they're progressing in that regard. And they have finally a native bridging communication protocol to be able to send assets to and from Ethereum. So some of the pros and cons of Optimism, first and foremost, is significantly cheaper. The transaction fees vary between 5 to 20 times cheaper. They batch multiple transactions. They actually get cheaper the more transactions that they handle, up to a certain threshold, of course. But right now, if Optimism processes more transactions, it's actually cheaper than if it processes, just 1-2 transactions. So with some of the CK-EVM chains that just recently launched, that's one of the reasons why we're seeing them being more expensive at the moment. They should get cheaper as they manage more transactions. They're also more scalable, of course. So theoretically, at the moment, they can handle up to 100x more transactions per second. I say theoretically because since there's less transactions being processed right now, that's just like the capacity. But at the moment, we still haven't reached those thresholds. And they are significantly faster. And this is like already today, they take on average, and this is like one of the indicators that we just launched, transactions take on average 0.3 seconds versus on Ethereum, which is consistently 12 seconds. So that's about a 40x improvement. And going into the cons, as I just mentioned, it's significantly less decentralized. So there is trust at this moment in the Optimism sequencer. They have, the fault proofs and some mechanisms to mitigate that trust and also make it more censorship resistant. But at the end of the day, they're moving towards decentralizing the sequencer. It's less reliable in the sense of downtime, like it's had in the past, not just Optimism, but other layer 2s, periods where the network is down, also because it's more centralized. And in upgrades, like in the upcoming Bedrock Upgrade, which we'll get into, it's also projected to have some downtime to be able to upscale the network. And at the moment, this doesn't necessarily have to be by default, but layer 2s are significantly less liquid. So it has less capacity for, large capital inflows and volumes. It's as I'll show, significantly more catered to retail users. So what does the Optimism ecosystem look like right now? First and foremost, as I mentioned, transactions are significantly cheaper. So even now in early May, when we saw some meme coins and transaction fees get more expensive in the base layer, which itself makes it more expensive for layer 2, we saw average transactions still remain within $2 at the highest. Some could argue it's still expensive, but on average they've been by and large below $1, which is about 5 to 20 times cheaper than Ethereum on average, and this is expected to become even cheaper. In terms of transactions, it grew. The Ethereum network grew quite significantly in 2022, from about 50,000 transactions to a peak of almost 800,000 transactions per day. They did have a incentive program that managed to spur the network faster, but you can see here quite sharp decline when they finished those incentives, particularly those regarding NFTs that they had at a certain point, and they've sort of settled at a higher low, doing about 4 times higher than they were a year ago prior to the incentive program. The addresses holding ETH on Optimism, so this is like theoretically the max limit for the potential number of users on Optimism has been accelerating. So from just a few thousand in early 2022 to about 2.8 million at this time, and accelerating the pace of growth. So that's a good sign that there's interest from people bridging from mainnet to Optimism and testing applications there. Daily active addresses have remained quite high. So even though transactions themselves declined, the number of active addresses held up quite well. So we're still seeing around the range that we did at the peak in 2022, holding up with just about 50 to 100K addresses per day, which is quite significant for a new network. And one interesting data point that I found was that they are addresses on Optimism on average are 5 times more active on a daily basis. So 3% of addresses are of the total addresses holding Ethereum are active on a daily basis. So we have this ratio called the active addresses ratio, just divides the daily active addresses over total addresses. It's a good measure for frequency of use, and it's significantly higher in Optimism, I suspect also probably on Arbitrum, than on layer 2, and this may come as no surprise as the networks are significantly cheaper to use. On that note, the average transaction size per our transaction volume in USD by size is 1000x smaller, so even larger than I anticipated, to be honest. So the majority of volume within Optimism is within the range of $1,000 to $10,000 per transaction. That's in volume terms, and count is actually even lower. Whereas in Ethereum, the vast majority of the volume happens in transactions of $1 million to $10 million. So that's a 1000x difference. And, you know, as I mentioned, being fees, it's a lot more retail users than in mainnet, of course. So for the DeFi ecosystem, of course, being a key part within crypto, we see that the total value for Optimism grew significantly in 2022. Here we had like the Avi incentives hit a new high for the whole layer 2 of Optimism. But recently we've seen in 2023 TVL rebound significantly and still holding up just within 20% of the previous all-time high, which is a lot better than how other blockchains are faring, especially alternative layer 1s, which are down like 80-90% in TVL terms. And a few protocols that stand out within Optimism. One is Velodrome, which is the largest protocol by TVL. It is a fork of Solidly, the protocol that originally Andre Cornier had proposed. It essentially is a DEX combining several different types of token incentive mechanisms with their VE33 model. And that has led to a lot of liquidity provider incentives and led them to become the largest protocol in that regard. And they have, you know, a growing community with about 37,000 addresses holding the Velo token. And then we have Synthetix, which was originally in Ethereum mainnet, but since their contracts are complex and very expensive to use in mainnet, they've been since 2021 in the part of the Optimism testnet. And within Optimism, they've already grew to 56,000 addresses holding the SNX token. And they have already shipped several products on top of the Synthetix suite of products. So you have derivatives on Quenta, you have options on Lyra, and a few other like marketplaces for hedging the debt from Synthetix, for instance. There's a whole suite of products, and it's the second largest protocol, not just in terms of TVL, but actually in terms of revenues, is also quite significant. And also, of course, we have a burgeoning stablecoin ecosystem within Optimism. So USDC, just like in mainnet, is the main stablecoin. It processes about 50,000 daily transactions and 500 million already in daily volume. So what comes ahead for Optimism? There are several upgrades, as I mentioned, that are in the pipeline for Ethereum, for Optimism, but also on the Ethereum base layer that will affect the performance of Optimism. The main one and the most recent update that's set to happen, I guess that's the soonest to come, is the Bedrock Upgrade. They've been working on this upgrade for, I believe, over a year now. It's the first major upgrade to the Optimism virtual machine. They're calling it the OVM 2.0, or part of that transition to the OVM 2.0. So as I mentioned, with the sequencer, you batch transactions of multiple transactions taking place in the layer 2, and you send the proof to layer 1. And what that happens is that it creates data and costs to batch every transaction, and therefore optimizing it creates a lot of potential to make the network more effective and efficient. So they are essentially optimizing batch compression, significantly reducing fees per their documentation. I couldn't find official numbers on how much of an improvement it will be, but I do have some numbers from other upgrades. All in all, they're trending towards lower fees. And that's part of the plan of the roll-up centric roadmap, to have most of the activity, at least for smaller users, to move into Optimism and other L2s. They will also implement some changes to the bridge security. So they'll have like a two-step approach for bridging versus the one-step approach that they have now. And it'll improve the intricacies of the bridging layer and the communication between chains, as well as reducing the bridging times, which is one of the largest complaints that users get right now for Optimism. It'll also have improved node performance, so making it easier to validate what is going on the Optimism layer 2, and reducing the state growth by 15 gigabytes per year, which also contributes to the lower fees that I mentioned before. And they're also expanding the universe of proofs that they support. So this is part of their OP stack layer that they've been working on. So now you essentially can host applications like your different layer 2 on top of the Optimism stack, so the layer 2 that they've created. And they support different types of proofs, so not just optimistic rollups, but also they'll be able to support CK snarks for CK rollups in the near future, and that will get started with the Bedrock Upgrade. And it's been announced recently that it's going to be happening in June, so next month, and there's been some anticipation building up for it. And the other major announcement, perhaps even greater than the Bedrock Upgrade, is their vision of being Superchain, and that goes into the OP stack layer that I was discussing. So not just multi-chain in terms of like having multiple chain manage transactions at the same time, but instead having a super chain, which is like a connected layer of multiple L2s in parallel operating and managing transactions for users. So in short, the Optimism layer 2 right now is like, you can think about it as of a generalized layer that they've already launched. It's likely to continue being the core for Optimism, but they've also created this option for developers to build using that OP stack. So replicating the infrastructure that the Optimism L2 has and being able to customize it. You can make it not just generalized, but you can also do like your own app chain, kind of like in Cosmos, you can create your own L1 on top of the Cosmos L0 SDK. Optimism is doing a similar approach where you can create a whole network of L2s and have intercommunication between these L2s. So that creates parallelism within all L2s, which should add longer term more scalability since there's like multiple layers in parallel, each being able to process a lot more transactions than the Ethereum mainnet, and also creates some sovereignty where each layer 2 on top of the OP stack can customize the parameters. They can have, multiple node validators. They can have one centralized sequencer. They can be generalized and have like a full spectrum of applications, or they can just be an app chain focused on just one single product. And that creates a lot of flexibility, and I imagine will bring a lot of new products and creativity from developers. And they'll be all interconnected by this bridging and communication layer. And right off the bat, when they announced that super chain vision, they announced that Coinbase will do their first pilot for the base layer, and this will be a layer 2 on top of the Optimism stack. They already have expected to be supported by tens of protocols active in layer 1. And given their large user base, there's a lot of anticipation that this can bring growth to Ethereum as a whole, but also to Optimism. So all of these chains within the OP stack are also part of the fees are redirected to Optimism. From my research, I couldn't find the specific numbers. I don't know if it will be different for each chain or if it will be like consistent for all chains, but there's also some value accrual for the OP token coming out of that. And then the second one that they announced that's actually already live is the Ribbon IAVO app chain. So for those that are not familiar, Ribbon is a derivatives protocol, and they launched an options marketplace that's already live on top of the OP stack, and it's its own app chain, which makes fees, a fraction of the cost, and also it's not nearly as affected by activity happening in other L2s. And more recently, I just saw this week that WorldCoin, the project behind Sam Altman is behind the project, along with some other people. Can be controversial. The Orb project validating digital identity on chain. They are also launching their own layer 2 on top of the OP stack. So that's it for like Optimism native upgrades. And then the final upgrade that is definitely one of the largest catalysts probably between now and the end of the year is what's known as Proto-Danksharding. So this is a product of EIP 4844, and it's set to take place, it's set to be implemented within the upcoming Dencun upgrade. So within the Cancun part of Dencun upgrade. So it's going to be an execution layer improvement for Ethereum that essentially introduces a new type of transaction called data blobs, which make the data storage of these transactions for rollups significantly cheaper, like orders of magnitude cheaper. Some people, I think Vitalik even has said it will be 100x cheaper than it's now. Some more recent estimates I've seen quote 10x improvement. But overall, fees already being less than $1 on average on rollups, having those scale to be 10 cents, or in the optimistic case, no pun intended, just 1 cent. This should create a significant difference for applications and hopefully make it easier for user adoption for these applications and encourage also more development. And it's part of the rollup centric roadmap that Vitalik highlighted in a blog post back in, I believe, 2021. This is materializing that vision where not just Optimism, of course, this goes for all layer 2s, will see significantly higher throughput and lower costs, with the goals of migrating activity there and just having Ethereum be the core layer within these modular chains being all on top of them. And finally, this is after after Bedrock, after 4844, Optimism is in the path of decentralizing the sequencer, with the goals of being more, decentralized themselves and censorship resistant, which of course are some of the core pillars behind Ethereum. So the idea is to have multiple validators and block producers within the sequencer, not just the Optimism team, as it's the case right now. And there is few information about how exactly they're going to do it. There's perspectives from all different scenarios. There's actually even protocols launching just to help with the process of decentralizing the sequencer. And essentially, there's an economic mechanism where there's a market for these fees and essentially incentivizing all of the different sequencers. That's one of the solutions that has more information available right now. But they also say that they'll have a governance mechanism. So OP, of course, being a governance token, there has some component to that. It hasn't, they didn't specify exactly how it would work, but in short, they mentioned that the goal with the governance mechanism is to prevent short-term value extraction and instead prioritize long-term network health. Initially, they had this set for 2023 roadmap, but they also had scheduled Bedrock for Q1 2023. So I wouldn't be surprised if this extends to perhaps Q4 of this year, or most likely even 2024. Whereas the upgrade, the EIP 4844, is likely to happen in Q3 or Q4 of this year. So all in all, a lot of upgrades coming for the Optimism stack and the OP token. Throughout the 2 years that the chain has been live on mainnet, I think less than 2 years actually, Optimism has already developed a growing network. It's got significant amount of user growth, as well as developer activity, and it's managed to help scale Ethereum. Of course, it's not nearly a finished product right now, so it's still in the process of improving even further. Growth did decelerate a bit after the incentive program finished, as tends to happen with all incentive programs, but they did remain at a significantly higher level. So as I mentioned, transactions are still about 4 to 5 times what they were before, and daily active addresses actually held up at almost the same level as they were during the incentive program. The ecosystem of applications building on top of Optimism has continued to grow, and not just within the Optimism layer 2 that's existing, but in the near future within the OP stack expansion for the Superchain Vision. So that's something that it's coming real soon. I think Base is planning to launch in July from last information that I found. It's already on testnet. And we should see more chains come as they make this completely open source and permissionless for anyone to build their own superchain upon the OP stack. And finally, fees are likely to get even more cheap. So significantly cheaper with a Bedrock upgrade. I don't know, from estimates, probably somewhere between like 3 to 5x cheaper. And then with the 4844, that can be 10x to 100x cheaper. So all in all, perhaps between now and 2024, Optimism should be 30 to 200x cheaper, according to expert estimates, which of course is a order of magnitude greater, and hopefully help crypto get broader adoption over the near to medium term. And finally, they're also likely to decentralize the sequencer. There's still a lot of discussions there on the best approaches for that, but it is on the horizon, and that should make Ethereum decentralized, not just on the layer 1 settlement, but also on the layer 2 execution. So thanks, everyone. That's it for today. Next webinar, we'll be going back to AI. Our CEO, Jesus, who has a breadth of knowledge in AI, will be talking about generative AI and Web3, diving into some ambitious ideas of integrating generative AI, the whole engine behind ChatGPT, into the world of Web3 and how those collide. So make sure to sign up now. Our team just shared the link. You can see it in the chat, and I'll be sticking around for a few questions if you guys have any. So thanks again. I see a question. Okay, Mehdi is saying, thanks for sharing amazing information. Where can I access the recorded webinar? yeah, we'll be posting the recording itself on YouTube, probably also on our Twitter, and along with the slides. So the slides will also be, I guess the slides might not be in YouTube, but they'll be in our Twitter and probably in our Medium as well. And in the newsletter for Into the Block, we'll also share those. If you guys haven't signed up for the newsletter, it's a weekly newsletter where we also keep these links handy. Rafael and Joshua are thanking me. Thank you guys. Always happy to have people here, especially in the bear market, still paying attention to the growing ecosystem and what's happening behind all the noise. I'll say for one last question, if it comes up, I'll give 30 seconds to a minute. And if not, thanks again, guys. Hope you all enjoyed testing the metrics that we have live. So these are in our platform, they're ready to go. You can test it for Optimism, and also, you know, for all of the chains, all of the protocols built on top of the chain. So I believe we support about 10 or 20 tokens on Optimism right now. So make sure to check those out. If you haven't, you can get a free trial for Optimism. Joshua is saying Optimism versus Polygon. So quite vague comment. Okay, which is better, layer 2 or a world scale project? It's a good question. And I'll preface by saying that Polygon, the network that is live right now, is actually not a layer 2. It's one of the biggest misconceptions in crypto. It's actually like a side chain is the correct term. So not all of the settlement happens within Ethereum. They actually have their own stakers, and that Matic has a lot of the value coming from that. They have their own parallel staking. So it's like a proof of stake chain that sends some validity to Ethereum, but it's not as full on top of Ethereum. That being said, Polygon just recently launched their CK EVM, and I believe they have like 2 other CK EVM projects in parallel that are layer 2s themselves. So I think Polygon is also going for like a modular ecosystem with different layers on top of Ethereum. I think both have very interesting approaches, but they've taken somewhat different approaches. So Optimism has been more like grassroots for developers. Like I guess they did have like an incentive program, but they've been less involved in biz dev deals with companies and things like that. Whereas Polygon has been going after, you know, Starbucks, Reddit, a lot of these brands that consumers use nowadays. Some of them, like Disney, already canceled those plans. So I think there are 2 different approaches. All in all, they were likely, like right now, it's still unclear which is going to be the winner, as well as, of course, Arbitrum, which has even higher activity levels. They're all taking slightly different approaches, but in general, they should in aggregate help scale blockchains and get us faster to millions of users in crypto. Not sure if it'll be this year, but in the near term, we're likely to go there, and all fulfilling the modular chain vision on top of not just Ethereum, but I guess some other L1s as well. So thanks, guys. I've rambled on enough for today. I wouldn't say Optimism is more technical to use, Joshua. They're like, from the user perspective, you can just set up a MetaMask and use them. It's just as easy to use as Polygon. For building applications, it's actually simpler since it's EVM equivalent than other L2s. But okay, thanks, guys. Appreciate all listening to me, and hope to see you in the next webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.